My name is Byron Johnson. I direct the Institute for Studies of Religion here at Baylor University, and we're delighted to have with us today Gordon Melton. Gordon is a legendary figure in the field, and I was thinking a little bit earlier, he founded the Institute for the Study of American Religion over 40 years ago. He was sharing with me, he did this as a junior high school student in Southern California. That is a joke, but Gordon is an interesting character to a lot of people. He's a social scientist, but by training, he is actually a theologian as well as a historian. He completed his PhD at Northwestern, and he also did his MDiv at Garrett Theological Seminary. He's also a distinguished fellow here at ISR at Baylor University, and we have the privilege of collaborating with Gordon on a couple of new initiatives. He may have a chance during the Q&A to share some of those with you, but we're really excited to be connected to Gordon and his great work. He's published over 35 books, and he's most well known, I guess, for his encyclopedias. I've just brought one with me. I needed a wheelbarrow to bring it over today, but this is the 8th edition of his encyclopedia. It actually bears his own name, which I think is a good indication of his stature in the field. It's a real honor to have him with us today. He's going to chat with us for about 45 minutes, and then it'll be open to questions and answers, and I sure hope you brought a lot of good questions. So join me in welcoming Gordon Melton.
I appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to my few remarks this afternoon. I want to spend some time talking with you about some of what I see as the major trends in American religion. These are trends that we have picked up over the last 40 years working with the folks at the Institute for the Study of American Religion. As I was getting ready to come here, I saw one of your publications which offered to some insights into the complexities and depths of American religion. We are going to be doing exactly the opposite and try to offer some of the big picture ideas within which hopefully those findings of depth and complexity can be placed. One searches for images that encapsulate the changes that have overtaken American religion in the more than 2 centuries since the founding of the Republic. And that might assist in interpreting the abundance of data surfacing day by day about different trends in American religious practice, not to mention getting a handle on that increasingly important desire to discern the future of both religion in general and different religious communities in particular. In that regard, we pose the further question about the relevance of history in our approach to the present. From a historical perspective, the most important questions about American religion focus on Christianity. For most decades, the story of American religion has been the story of the Christian church's development and the generation of its many denominational expressions. Without a doubt, the most significant changes have occurred within and around the Christian community, including its appropriation as the majority religious expression of the Native Americans and African American communities. Over the several centuries from the 1790s to the present, it moved from being a relatively small minority community, but without any significant competitors, to being the overwhelmingly majority community, but now possessed of a number of significant competitors in the religious marketplace, representing the broad spectrum of the world's religions, not to mention an active and vocal community of unbelief, skeptics, humanists, atheists. When the dust settled from the American Revolution and the churches were disestablished, only a tiny minority of the population, between 10 and 15%, remained formally associated with the churches. And the churches themselves were in a weakened state. Many of the ministers, including the majority of Anglicans and Methodists, returned to England as hostilities developed, and the quality of those that remained were often in question. We must read the stories of believers from this era as accounts of the faithful few who were operating amid neighbors who were largely disconnected from Christianity and who manifested a lack of concern for religion in general. By the end of the 19th century, the efforts at evangelism and church recruitment seemed to have borne significant fruit, and the churches were in a state of relative prosperity. Church membership had grown significantly. It had only reached 30 to 35%, still well below 50%, but church leaders could see the gap closing. Equally important was population growth. The country had moved from around 4 million to 75 million, and from 13 states along the Atlantic coast to 48 states that reached across the continent. In absolute numbers, church membership had grown from around 500,000 to 25 million. For the churches beginning the new century, the future was bright. They had bases of operation in every community and had a clear vision of the goal before them. At the same time, one could begin to perceive forces of change. Though nothing to make the state to shake the sense that Christianity was moving into a dominant position of power in the culture, the first signs of future religious diversity had begun to appear. The esoterically minded had formed a popular spiritualist movement. There were theosophists, Christian scientists, and the initial centers of what would become the New Thought movement. Then right at the end of the century, some creative Protestant leaders tried out a new format for missionary work. Dialogue with leaders of the world's religious traditions that would hopefully engage them in the Christian worldview. To that end, they organized the first parliament of the world's religions, held over some 6 weeks in Chicago in the summer of 1893. The effort completely backfired, however, and the primary result of the parliament was the founding of the first English-speaking centers of Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim communities. Early in the 20th century, numerous American scholars, as they absorbed the guiding perspectives in their field of study, abandoned any idea of a continuing significant role for religion in Western culture. As late as the 1970s, most social scientists were still telling a version of the secularization story. It seemed clearly evident in Europe. In Eastern Europe, the state churches had been dismantled by an anti-religious government, and in Western Europe, the state churches were losing public support decade by decade. The European decline seemed to be manifesting in America, where the mainline Protestant churches were having their problems with slowing growth rates, then a leveling off, and then an actual decline in membership. The Jewish community remained in a 50-50 situation, with only half of the community attached to a synagogue. Evolutionary theory seemed relatively unchallenged, and psychotherapy had developed a massive presence. Few were prepared for what was about to occur. It all began to change in 1965. So what happened in 1965 to alter the storyline of American religion so dramatically? In the generation prior to World War I, population growth included immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italy, Poland, Russia, etc., while on the West Coast an increasing number of Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, and Indians arrived. Opposition to immigration from those areas grew around a number of issues from religion to race and coalesced in the 1924 legislation that blocked immigration from other than Northern and Western Europe. However, as the 1960s began, the United States found itself involved in a war in Vietnam and was seeking assistance from Asian allies. Part of the price for gaining that assistance was an end to the immigration restrictions imposed in 1924 and the insult that such restrictions implied. The new immigration bill placed Asian countries on the same immigration quotas as the Western European nations. Due primarily to this change in immigration law, the minuscule Asian and Middle Eastern religious communities, which included the whole spectrum of the world's religions from Advaita Hinduism to Zoroastrianism, began to grow at an unprecedented rate. This growth initially impacted the West Coast and several large metropolitan complexes like Houston, but by the 1990s it was visible in urban areas across the United States. At the same time that the Asian and Middle Eastern traditions started growing, the West's third religious tradition found multiple openings. What we call the New Age movement in the 1970s and 80s resulted in a monumental revival of that diverse, decentralized movement that in past generations we had labeled the occult, but which is more generally now termed the Western esoteric tradition. Today, the number of adherents of esotericism in the United States is greater than the combined adherents of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. The growth of religion on every front has reshaped American religion. The country is now home to all of the world's major religious traditions, each of which has been able to form one or more national association of centers. The large traditions were able to organize pan-denominational associations that moved to normalize the religion's presence in the secular culture and the political community. By the end of the 20th century, even smaller, newer religious groups, such as the neo-pagan Wicca group, could project a future of participation in the religious world as a substantive minority voice. The spectacular rise of different religious groups in the United States in the last generation could easily suggest the imminent arrival of a new religious establishment, one that would displace and even supersede the dominant role formerly served by Christianity. However, in fact, no such possibility has appeared on the horizon. The emergence of the new religious traditions in America has, as a whole, not come at the expense of Christianity, nor has Christianity stopped growing while they have grown. Rather, both have continued to whittle away at the still large community of the religiously unaffiliated, and both have continued to claim some from the new people that appear in the recruitment pool each year. Think for a moment. Between 1980 and 2000, for example, we added 55 million people to the population. We added another 30 million this decade alone. Current projections suggest that we will add another 40 million in the next decade. The point being that all of the religious groups have been able to continue their growth simultaneously, the growth of one not being dependent upon the decline of any other. The single most significant trend in American religion from 1900 to the present has been the steady and spectacular decline of the percentage of the religiously unaffiliated in the American population. In 1900, the religiously unaffiliated included some 65% of the population. That figure has now dropped to around 15%. That trend underlies a host of additional observations. The persistence of denominations. In the 1960s, in the wake of the founding of the World Council of Churches in 48 and the Second Vatican Council in 62, the United States participated in a growing wave of ecumenical enthusiasm that appears to have swept through the Christian world. During this era of good feeling that grew from the very real accomplishments of the Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox dialogue, a forward-looking group of theologians envisioned a united Christian church, or at the very least a united Protestant church. Prophetic voices pronounced obsolete the issues that had divided Christendom and argued that the immediate challenges facing the community of contemporary churches demanded a united front, reoriented around present priorities. Denominations were dysfunctional and Christians should welcome the new post-denominational era. Plans for church merger proliferated, and significant mergers culminated in, for example, the emergence of the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, Presbyterian Church USA, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. But the attempts to unite across denominational family lines demonstrated that the older denominational issues were still very much alive. It was not that a variety of resolutions to differences in theology and polity were not available. Rather, negotiators showed an inability to avoid, or in some cases even understand, the larger, often unspoken implications of the doctrinal and organizational differences they possessed. Thus, while denominations fell out of popularity in some circles, they persisted as the single stable structure amid all of the changes of the last decades of the 20th century. They remained important in that they were the way that religious life is structured in a free society. Denominations provide different ways to give form to a larger religious tradition. One cannot, for example, form simply a generic Christian church, or a generic Islamic mosque, or a generic Jewish synagogue. A Christian congregation or association of congregations has to make a host of decisions that grounds it in the particularity of a Christian life, just as a synagogue or mosque must make basic decisions about Jewish and Islamic life. In Christianity, crucial decisions must be made, for example, about the sacraments. How shall one baptize? By immersion, pouring, or sprinkling? And who will one baptize? Adults only, or infants and youth? How many sacraments will one have? 7? 3? 2? None? Who will be admitted to the sacraments? Only adult believers? All baptized Christians? Anyone? While every group is free to choose from all of the different options, no group is free to avoid making those decisions. It is also the case that in making these decisions, which appear to be simple, the group is also making a set of additional decisions about the nature of the Christian life and how the church relates to society as a whole. The older denominational groups persist in that they have found some very workable ways to structure the Christian life and have already experimented with many options that have proven less workable. They have also found more efficient means of serving parishioners and supplying them with a vehicle to express their faith. Thus, while within a free society many different denominations can arise, no one has yet found a better way to provide the week-in, week-out communal life for religious people. They may be called denominations by different names, pagan traditions or Buddhist sects or esoteric currents, but denominations are a persistent reality of contemporary religion, not just in America, but wherever a high degree of religious freedom exists. Given the persistence of denominations, the subsequent major reality of American religious life has been its ever-increasing pluralism. The United States was founded with less than 20 different religious communities, all Christian except for one small Jewish community. By 1900, that number had grown to more than 300, again, most Christian denominations. But the beginning of a blossoming esoteric community, or an esoteric community had just begun to blossom. By the end of the 20th century, there are now more than 2,000 different religious groups, with only about half of them being Christian. At the beginning of the 20th century, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam had just minimally made their presence felt. In the last half of the 20th century, the number of Buddhist, Hindu, and Islamic options represented most forms of the world's religions that were present globally in any strength. In addition, there was a host of uniquely American variations. There is at present some 200 Buddhist denominations in America. The pluralistic scene means that almost anyone, especially any urban dweller, now has the full spectrum of the world's religions from which to choose a faith. And one can pursue that faith at any level of commitment, from a full-time ordered community to a casual visit on the more important holidays, and those holidays being Wesak or Diwali, Rosh Hashanah or Ramadan. The summer solstice, or is about to happen in Dallas, the Vietnam New Year, 2 weeks. That being said, there are limits to pluralism. While there are 2,000 different religious groups from which Americans can choose, the majority of them have chosen to adhere to one of a mere 23 variations on traditional Christianity. That is to say, when one looks at the 23 largest Christian denominations in America, one can find the majority of all the religious believers in the country. That is, if you add up the membership of the 23 large groups, you get over 154 million people, and that's more than half the population. These 23 denominations represent the broad spectrum of contemporary Christianity in the West, inclusive of the Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox communities. They range from the highly liturgical to those engaged in the most informal kinds of worship. They range from the most conservative, such as the Baptist Bible Fellowship, who think Southern Baptists are a bunch of raving liberals, to the most liberal, the United Church of Christ. While differing on a host of issues, they share some common understandings of the Christian symbols and the boundaries defining who is in and who is outside of the Christian community. Together, those 23 churches represent the mainstream of the Christian heritage in America. Meanwhile, several of the post-Protestant groups have grown quite large and now play an important additional role in shaping the culture, namely the 2 million Jehovah's Witnesses and the 5 million plus members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because of Judaism's role as the parent religion to Christianity, it too has a special place in American religion. The Jewish faith, though having only around 4 million adherents in the United States, is the second largest religious tradition. Of the 30 or more Jewish denominations in America, 3 have emerged with a more than sizable following. As a result of a century of Jewish-Christian dialogue, the Jewish community has now attained a meaningful place as part of the American religious establishment, in spite of its relatively small size. The 3 large Jewish groups together comprise about 3.5 million people. Together, the 28 religious bodies mentioned above, along with some 70 additional Christian churches that have as many as 100,000 members, constitute America's religious establishment, in the sense that together they largely control the environment in which most Americans operate religiously. At the same time, to some degree, other religious groups have to react to and adjust to the environment these larger groups have created and maintained. These denominations set the backdrop for emergent theologies and new approaches to the spiritual life. Their members will form the public to be organized for interdenominational social movements and constitute the people to be wooed and won as controversies wax and wane. And while theologies, spiritualities, movements, issues, and controversies come and go, these denominations and their congregations persist and now await the next set of theologies, spiritualities, movements, issues, and controversies that will come on the scene in the years ahead. The persistence of Christian denominations through the last half of the 20th century and the existence of a dominating religious establishment provides the context for evaluating the emergence and institutionalizations of the world's religions in America. Following the changes of immigration law in 1965, Eastern religions began to grow. One of the smaller groups, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, became the single most visible Asian religion through the 1970s and 1980s, as its members engaged in public chanting and dancing on the streets of most urban centers, and in fundraising and book distribution at the nation's airports. Similarly, Buddhists were given a high profile from the large number of Anglo converts, many of whom became scholars. Although Asian religious groups formed by Euro-American converts have gained a higher profile, real growth has occurred from the annual movement of hundreds of thousands of Asians to the United States. Asian American Buddhists and Hindus have raised their profile slowly as they purchased and renovated abandoned church property, and then as they meticulously built their often elaborate temples, which have proliferated on the edges of the major urban complexes. The Buddhist community in America received an additional life from widespread publicity given the Dalai Lama, though the actual number of Tibetan Buddhist adherents in the United States remains relatively small. Though both the Buddhist and Hindu communities now number in the millions, their visibility nationally has been blunted by the uneven distribution of their members across the country. 40% of both communities reside in Southern California, with an additional strong presence in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is also the case that the Buddhist community is divided into the more than 200 sects we mentioned earlier, quite analogous to Christian denominations, with no one group having more than a few 100,000 members, the largest being the Soka Gakkai, which has as many as 250,000 adherents. Currently, the most visible of all the newly arrived world's religions in America are the Muslims. They also, like the Hindus and Buddhists, have become concentrated in Southern California, but are more evenly spread across the country and appear to have a larger number of adherents, though the actual number of Muslims in America is a matter hotly contested among those who try to count. My institute has taken a more conservative approach and looks at a practicing Muslim community of some 4 million, again split into a variety of sub-communities divided along the national lines of origin and differences of belief and practice. Just as non-Christians often do not see or understand the many divisions in Christianity, so many non-Muslims do not see the distinctive groups within the Muslim community. Relative to the United States, for example, the largest percentage of Muslims are of Indo-Pakistani origin, many associated with the Islamic Society of North America. The second largest group are African Americans. Both groups outnumber the Arab American community. Among the more prominent and older Muslim groups in America is the Ahmadiyya Muslim movement, which has a relationship to the larger Muslim establishment, not unlike that of Jehovah's Witnesses to the larger Christian establishment. And along with the Asian groups immigrating into the United States, we have seen the growth of more homegrown religions. Among the most noteworthy of the national and international movements of the last half of the 20th century was the New Age movement, a millennial movement that in the 1970s proposed the emergence of a new age of love and light to arrive early in the 21st century. As the movement underwent analysis, the New Age was seen as a revitalization movement within the older occult community. It was originally generated within and derived its initial support from some independent theosophical groups. Utilizing some older occult practices, the New Age movement called people's attention in a new and different context to the possibility of healing and transformation of their individual lives, while at the same time projecting a vision of broad social innovation. From England, the movement traveled to the United States and found popular support in a wide range of alternative religious groups, most relatively small. However, year by year, the movement grew and through the 1980s began to count its adherents in the hundreds of thousands and then in the millions. As it peaked toward the end of the 1990s, it is estimated that as many as 2 to 3% of the population were attracted to it, and many times that number at least minimally affected by it. We have high beliefs of reincarnation in America, anywhere from 20 to 25%. In the Southern African American community, that percentage is 10% higher. The same holds true for the practice of meditation or the belief in astrology. The New Age movement transformed the older, relatively minuscule occult community in what in the 1990s began to be called the Western esoteric community, a new name denoting the new level of respectability that these earlier despised and berated beliefs and practices had attained. The new name also came as the culmination of a generation of scholarship that had been done on esoteric groups, redefining them as part of a third religious tradition whose origins rival that of the more dominant Christian community. The esoteric tradition is a broken tradition whose adherents were, like the Jews, frequently the object of persecution, but which has since the 17th century been able to find an increasing space in the West. The Western esoteric tradition has supplied an alternative to the mainstream Orthodox tradition since the emergence of the Gnostics in the patristic period, the exact origins of Gnostics being another significantly contested issue in contemporary scholarship. Once Christianity became the dominant religious community in the West, groups with strong resemblance to the Gnostics regularly reappeared and were just as regularly hounded out of existence. However, in the growing atmosphere of religious freedom, Gnostic-like groups, some even assuming that name, have once again returned in force and now are taking their place in the larger religious landscape, offering further expansion to the pluralism to which provides a home. We can close this all too hasty survey of trends in American religions by noting the emergence of an organized and vocal movement that hangs together by their disparagement of theism. Unbelievers go under a variety of names: atheist, humanist, rationalist, secularist, freethinker, agnostic, to name a few. And it is no small task to understand the world of unbelief and how it relates to the Christian community specifically and the larger world of religious believers in general. On one end of the spectrum of unbelief are people who have thought about religious questions and have rejected any belief in God and any concern, even in a non-theistic way, with spirituality, transcendence, or the sacred. They are largely invisible as they have disassociated themselves from any religious inquiry. Next, we have those who are atheists but who remain engaged in religious questions and who have made the critique of belief in God and the adherence to religion a matter of ongoing concern. Such folks often feel that religion is a social evil, that it has significant dirt on its hands from past and present evils in which it has participated, primarily in efforts of social control. These atheists often adhere to the several national and many local atheist organizations, such as the Freedom from Religion Foundation, headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin, and have since the 1960s become increasingly active in the public square on a spectrum of social issues, most notably in issues having to do with separation of church and state. Atheists will divide on whether or not to make common cause with religious people on specific issues about which they will agree. Slightly further along the unbelief spectrum are the humanists. While atheists argue about whether to cooperate with the religious on common concerns, humanists argue about being religious. Humanists offer a total worldview that attempts to meet many needs generally ascribed to religion: an ethical perspective, ritual, community, identification with and response to human suffering. A non-theistic humanist religious perspective began to be articulated at the edge of the Unitarian community early in the 20th century, and it grew into what is now the American Humanist Association. Possibly the largest such humanist community in the West is now in Norway, whose humanist organization constitutes the largest of the dissenting groups within the country. The largest community of non-religious humanists are now affiliated with the Council of Secular Humanism here in America. The development of the spectrum of organized unbelief presents a set of problems to any analysis of American religion. As noted earlier, as spectacular as any trend in American religion through the 20th century has been the dwindling of the percentage of the religiously unaffiliated from 65% to a mere 15%. Interestingly, the actual number of the unaffiliated community has remained about the same. That is, in 1900 it was about 40 to 50 million. Today it's the same as that. What has changed has been the number of people who identify themselves as having no religion, moving from 14 million in 1990 to 34 million in 2008. That number represents a mixed bag of people, from committed atheists to committed mystics who remained unattached to a religious community. Most atheists are not members of any atheist organization, the logic of their position usually driving them to other concerns. Meanwhile, there are many among the unaffiliated who remain uncommitted to any position, as they simply have not yet gotten around to thinking about religious issues. Some within the unbelief community count on all the unaffiliated as their allies and are encouraged that so many have apparently chosen not to affiliate with a religious organization. Many Christians see these same people as the unchurched, potential converts. Those of a particular ethnic background are seen as merely inactive members of one of the ethnic-based religions, such as the Russian Orthodox or the Lubavitch Hasidists. In any case, the presence of a vocal community of unbelief, what we might think of as the religiously irreligious, provides those who see theism as nonsense and religion as a waste of time with a community with whom they can identify. The present community also calls attention to the existence of unbelief as a tradition that reaches back to colonial times, claims heroes of the Revolution from Thomas Paine to Ethan Allen, claims at least one president, Thomas Jefferson, and has played a significant role in enlivening America's intellectual currents through the 19th and 20th century to the present. As we write the story of American religion in the future, we will speak of four traditions interacting from the 17th century to the present: the Christian, the Jewish, the Western esoteric, and the tradition of unbelief. As American religion begins the 21st century, it does so in a very positive environment. With few exceptions, religious communities are in a growth trajectory, the growth of one not dependent upon the growth or decline of others, and often accomplished without awareness of the rise and fall of religious neighbors. Given the projected population growth and current immigration policies, the continued growth of religion seems to be the story that will dominate in the religious community. Those groups that continue to lose members will be the exception, and their losses in such a context a matter for continued serious reflection. While non-Christian groups will continue to grow during the next generation, there is nothing on the horizon to suggest a loss of Christian hegemony in the religious community as a whole, nor have any groups appeared that even will begin to challenge that hegemony. At the same time, religious leaders reflecting on the global situation appear ready to offer other religions a level of freedom and respect to operate significantly beyond mere tolerance that would have hardly been imaginable even a century ago. The new level of religious pluralism even reaches out to the new humanist atheist community, whose observations are now welcomed into the discussion on basic religious concerns. And I thank you for your attention. I don't have a watch up here, but I assume we have time for questions. You'll have to tell me when to cut it off if I have excited any comments or questions. I would welcome them.
So on the issue about the persistence of denominational spring, what's your take on this sort of post-denominational mood that you see among a lot of, especially Christians, although there may be parallels in other groups, too, where people seem to be very proud of not having, they don't care about what their denomination is, and yet you're saying that regardless of what people say about that, the denominations are still really the only option for organizing people's faith. So what's your take on that?
In the society at large, we have a couple of problems that those folks are trying to address. One of them is within young people especially, you see a trend toward being spiritual but not religious. With 2,000 denominations, you have another problem. If you found a new church, what are you going to call it? The actual number of names that are now left available to different groups is a real problem. It's manifested as the New Age movement began to make its transition in the 90s, in that someone had actually copyrighted or trademarked the term New Age, used in that kind of context. You also have the question that religion itself is now a contested category very much on the edge of the community. One of the problems in comparing America and Europe, for example, is that a lot of things we call religion here are defined in Europe as not religion. So you have this tremendously large esoteric community in France, but it's never counted as part of France's religious community. So the post-denominational groups are all trying to deal with that spectrum of problems. But in fact, as they get down to the particularities of forming a community and making those forced decisions they have to make, who's going to run the community, what are we going to call the people who run the community, how are we going to get Sunday school material, who from, etc. You have to make decisions, and those decisions place you within a denominational tradition. You just can't help it. And to be naive about that will just get you into trouble. So I have sympathy with the folks. I think in sometimes it's sort of deceptive to try to do that, but at the same time, you've got that name problem. What are you found a new church, what are you going to call yourself? And then if you are so bland in your name, our group is the Christian Assembly. Well, you don't communicate very much as to who and what you are, and that becomes another problem. So it's a real issue, and the issue of the contested nature of religion, this is very much a problem with the mega churches. And so you have large denominational mega churches who have dropped the denominational name from the Saddleback Church, big Southern Baptist church down in my backyard. And we see that happening all the time. People get there and they discover, I joined the church, now I'm part of the Southern Baptist. I've got that load to carry. So it's the same way. There's a whole bunch of big Methodist churches too. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think religion became important in the early American Revolution?
We only reached a 50% church membership during World War II. So religion became increasingly important generation by generation. What we call the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, was a time when a group of people saw the need and got out and evangelized the country. And that became an important part of it. Once the country was founded, especially during the 19th century, we had what we had little of prior to the Revolution, namely the movement of whole religious communities here. So you had whole groups like the Missouri Synod people coming here as a religious group, dissenting. Most of the people who came here before the American Revolution were sort of the dregs of society. They were the people who had the least attachment to things at home, and that included religion. They came here for a new life, and so that explains the low religious affiliation at the time of the Revolution and afterwards. And it became a real problem as the country began to develop. And then right at the time of the American Revolution was the time of the deist movement. And the deists played an important role in the revolution, Franklin, Jefferson, etc. So it was kind of a secular revolution in which some of the Christians participated and some didn't. And, but it becomes a growing concern decade by decade. And certainly by the end of the 19th century, it was on the public agenda. Yes, sir.
You made some comments on the following two statements. One is America is the most religious and most secular country in the world. And the second one is someone said due to the demise of the New Deal Commission and the rise of the new Christian
First comment in terms of America being the most religious, I think it probably is. I can't think of another country that is more religious in history than America is right now. To think of a country where 75% of the population, 85% actually, counting in the non-Christian segment, has voluntarily chosen to be a part of a religious community and have found a religious community that suits their level of religiosity. That's phenomenal, and it doesn't exist in many places. There are some countries that are trying to catch up with us, and may do it, but it's really a phenomenal accomplishment of what's gone on here. When you get to the issue of being the most secular, part of the problem is that word secular is so loaded with meanings that you can say that and deny it at the same time, and both statements would be true. In terms of just outward religiosity, it's not true. We are not the most secular country in the world. But at the same time, we are a country that has gone through a number of revolutions and in terms of technology and the development of science, such that the competition to religion now is just so significant. In the 19th century, the pastor, having a seminary education, could think of himself as one of the most educated people in the town or city he lived in. Now the pastor with a graduate school education, just another bloke, maybe in the top half of the community, but he's just another fellow. There's a whole bunch of people out there with degrees. It used to be that the church provided you with your entertainment. You got up and went to Mass every morning in 16th century France because that was the funnest thing to do. And those cathedrals provided you with a lot of stimulus and helped build your senses. The Protestant revival meetings were great entertainment. You went, you got to sing, you got to listen to some good oratory, you got to meet with your friends and what have you. And nowadays there's just all kinds of entertainment. I can remember when we killed off the revival movement. I remember when Oral Roberts quit, when Billy Graham quit, and what have you. They quit because of air conditioning. The summer season went away because people would rather stay home in an air-conditioned living room than to go out and be entertained at a revival meeting in a hot and stuffy tent. There are those kinds of things. There are certain symbols as the culture has moved on and we've changed. There are certain symbols of religiosity that we lost. And as we lose those kinds of things, we often don't see the things that replaces them, and that our religiosity continues and even continues to grow, but it does so in forms that leaves some dearly loved things we used to do behind. And that becomes a real problem. Of course, now we've got the large urban air-conditioned auditoriums, the big super places for crowds that you can go and you can have revival meetings again. So we're having. And remind me of the second question, I'm sorry.
If the advice on new tradition and advice on the new Christian white, Melton struggle has changed from a class-based struggle to the culture war, which is based on religion and ideology.
Yeah, I think the idea of the culture war is largely something that's talked about within the right itself. The rest of the Christian community, that larger segment, what we call the liberal Protestant community, Catholic community, doesn't see it that way. And it will be interesting to see if that continues now in kind of the post-Jerry Falwell era, the post-Pat Robertson era, as to whether that idea of the culture war would continue. Never became really popular among Catholics and liberal Protestants, and it was largely an idea that the religious right wanted to talk about. It's sort of based on a couple of things in terms of a lot of folks in the religious right were seeing people on the Christian left and in the Catholic community as not quite Christian. You know, we are the Christians. Those are sort of halfway Christians, inadequate Christians. But they were the larger half of the community. And they carried a much larger tradition. Once you got out of America, the American evangelical movement was always a very small part of the overall complex of those So I think that that idea of the culture wars is going to have to be recast, and those of us who call ourselves evangelicals will have to find another way to understand our place in the culture. It's going to be interesting what happens with the National Association of Evangelicals now having talks of merger with the National Council of Churches, and of a new organization that includes churches from both groups in it as a large ecumenical concern. That represents the return of evangelicals to a churchy, non-sectarian kind of position in the culture, where they're seen as having their place. But at the same time, the loss of these major leaders who brought evangelicalism into the public square, we're yet to see how that's going to work.
Well, Gordon is going to stick around in case some of you would like to ask questions one-on-one. So again, join me in welcoming or thanking Gordon.